Hey everyone, my name is Scruffy. We have to talk. Flicker Strike is the last one on our list of League Starter builds for 323 Affliction, and you can check out all the others in our preview video. Keep in mind that those builds are only designed for players that want to play something off-meta, kinda rippy builds, and those guides should help you to get into a different playstyle like Magic Find or Auto Bomber. For established meta builds, especially new players, check out the other content creators that were linked in the video as well. This right here is going to be our League Starter guide for Flicker Strike, but I have to switch the chapters for this video a little bit. We start first talking about the 323 changes and why our guide took so long to make, before I then talk you through everything you need to know from leveling to endgame. So our idea was to make some rather unusual builds for this season, because last time we got told that Toxic Rain and Explosive Arrow are too generic. Flicker Strike is definitely not an uncommon build. Everyone knows about it, and it's rather controversial instead of unusual. I have actually played the Fire Flicker Strike during the Ultimatum League back in the days. Flicker Strike is such an extremely outfigured build. I don't even know where to start. Players made fire versions, physical versions, cold versions, chaos versions, and even mana stacking versions of it. We do believe that our Fire Flicker Strike will grant you an awesome and cheap start into the season, but then we thought, what's going to happen after that? When do players transition away from fire and start going for Cold Flicker Strike? This is usually the strongest version of it that you can find on PoE Ninja. There's no way for us to make a cold version of Flicker Strike anywhere near League Startable, because it will cost you dozens, maybe even hundreds of Divine Orbs later on, which you could strive for when playing Flicker Strike, but fire is a perfect entry version of it. But if you're looking for a physical version, Mage Fist made a video about it a few days ago. Then next to the nerfs, Chaos Spirit is dead, and the rage mechanic is not viable anymore without it. Mage Fist's physical flicker build uses the Berserker Ascendancy to compensate for that. Cold Flicker often goes for Raider, and most go for Slayer. Heat Shiver is also nerfed, so even Cold Flicker on a lower budget is going to lose some damage. We had the idea of going Champion instead, using finally the Warlock of the Mist Ascendancy. This new Ascendancy gives us a 50% life reservation efficiency, and we could have reserved plenty of auras with health until we reach around 51% health, then use Anger with Divine Blessing to manually trigger Adrenaline of the Champion Ascendancy. This would give us 100% more damage and some attack and movement speed. Was a cool idea, we thought. It could be still an interesting idea that we are happy to share with you right now, but our build today is not going to feature that anymore. It is way too experimental, requires fine-tuning on auras like Precision, which are flat mana amount, and all the additional layers of defenses we could use as a champion are easily compensated by just going Slayer immediately. We also looked into the transfigured Flicker Strike that released yesterday. Flicker Strike of Power uses power charges instead of frenzy charges, and we could then maybe use Badge of the Brotherhood to have insanely high power and frenzy charges, but it doesn't look great. Most Flicker Strike builds will reach 100% crit anyway, so power charges lose a lot of their value. Badge of the Brotherhood is still very expensive, especially early into the season, and we couldn't reach anywhere near the damage output of some of the top Flicker Strike builds. We tried changing the PoB config to use this Transfigured gem, but couldn't find a way to make it viable. It was fun though, looking into all the variations of Flicker Strike players could play, and maybe throughout the season, players would come up with some insanely cool ways to use the Transfigured gem. After looking into all of this, we decided to stick to our initial idea with a Fire Flicker Strike starter, but sadly, we dropped the idea of the Champion Ascendancy. If you watch this video and you like the idea of the Warlock of the Mist Ascendancy with life reservation and as a champion maybe, please let us know in the comments if you came up with something interesting. Flicker Strike is an insanely interesting skill itself. Sadly, it receives a lot of changes due to item nerfs that are very impactful. But anyways, oh boy, did I had a lot of fun playing our Fire Flicker version when I tested it. And without further ado, let's hop into our Fire Flicker Strike Slayer. During the campaign, you pick up Splitting Steel whenever reaching the first town. Splitting Steel is receiving some interesting changes, and you no longer have Call of the Steel, which is pretty convenient. At level 4, we get a lot of the here listed gems, and at level 8, we pick up our main support before we fight Brutus. In Act 2, we kill all bandits and add more support gems to the setup. This continues in Act 3, where we add a vulnerability instead of Sniper's Mark, and at level 38, we get multiple totem support, which allows us to play Ancestral Protector and War Chief, which will grant us a lot of single target damage. You could here already pick up a Flicker Strike gem from the library and level it up on the side, so you don't have to switch later on, and your gem is still level 1. The leveling talent tree is here, which differs a lot from our mid-game tree. Splitting Steel is a projectile gem, and we would suggest to keep playing Splitting Steel until you switch to Flicker Strike. We switch to Flicker Strike as soon as we can afford it. More about the items as soon as we talk about gear. Mid-game talent tree is here, and our endgame talent tree is going to add more damage and sockets like Inspired Learning later on when you're having the money for it and you already reached level 90 plus or higher. We also focus more on defensive talents like armor and evasion rating, because we will use more defenses in our build to make it tankier and use our tankiness to our advantage with our belt. Before we talk about gear, here are the masteries that we want to scale with this build. Our ascendancies are as follows. We start with Impact, then Bane of the Legends. Masterful Form is going to be our third ascendancy, giving us more frenzy charges in preparation for our Flicker Strike. Overwhelm is our last ascendancy. Now as a Slayer, we once again go for the Primalist ascendancy with the Charm Sockets. Look out for those juicy explosion and charges Charm Sockets. When we now talk about gear, keep in mind that I will suggest you some unique items that would be really awesome to have. I will prove you with price charts that you can afford these items even on day 1, unless they suddenly become more expensive than the last 2 seasons, for whatever reason. Aura Sacrifice is our Flicker Strike Sword. It costs you 1 Chaos Orb, causes you to deal fire damage and no physical damage anymore, and utilizes our fire damage talents in the bottom left. You can later on save some money for Rakiata's Dance. This sword was introduced last season in the Trial of the Ancestors and makes its way back into the core game. It will be expensive, but something to aspire to. Our boots are the regular Flicker Strike boots, Dark Ray Vectors. Also, again, a very cheap item though. Keep in mind that cheap items like this will be often bought to corrupt them, but you should not focus on corrupting them, just keep that in the back of your mind. Devotor's Devotion is another cheap item. At this point I think PoE Ninja is bugged, and everything is just 1 chaos. And another 1 chaos item, Perseverance, I hope I spelled this right, Vanguard Belt. This belt makes us use our extra defensives with Determination and Defiance Bender, and maybe even Grace if you had the mana reservation somewhere. You also gain Fortify whenever you stun an enemy. Stunning is caused by physical damage that is a certain higher amount than the enemy's health, and this belt then also grants us Onslaught. Other gear is focusing on added elemental damage and if possible reduced mana costs, or even mana reservation on chest. Otherwise, we are using these gloves and Eldritch and Blizzards. These stats on a chest, and your amulet could use these stats with an anoint to either Panopticon for more of your totems, or Frenetic for more frenzy charge. Here's a shopping list that you should focus on in the start of the season. As Flask, we are super generic with regular Flask, used by many builds. Life Flask with instant recovery and immunity to bleeding. Keep in mind that if you have a Flask with instant recovery, but open suffix, you can craft it in the bestiary to add the bleeding immunity. Granite Flask with extra armor, Jade Flask with extra evasion, Diamond Flask with extra crit, Quicksilver with extra movement. And as a prefix for them, you choose either charge on crit or anything else in the early game except for the reduced duration. Our gem setup looks as follows. We're gonna use Vaal Flicker Strike, but you don't really have to focus on the Vaal skill. Vaal Flicker Strike is rather a meme. It does not feel or play nice. Close combat support, elemental damage with attacks, Multi-Strike, Endurance Charge on melee stun, and Fire Penetration are the gems that we're going to use in the beginning. Replace the Endurance Charge on melee stun with an Inspiration gem if you struggle with mana early on. Vaal Ancestral War Chief, Ancestral Protector, and multiple totems is going to be our totems that we use. Sniper's Mark and Mark on Hit is going to be our curse. Leap Slam and Faster Attacks is our movement skill. Immortal Core level 3, cast when damage taken level 1, and an increased duration gem gonna add us some extra defensive. Enduring Cry will also be used in this build. We use Blood Rage in this build as well. Keep in mind you don't have to use it all the time. Every time you kill an enemy, it will refresh its duration. Our auras are Determination, Anger, Defiance Bender, and an Enlightened gem maybe. If you can't afford the Enlightened gem, that should be fine in the beginning. If you then really still struggle with mana in the beginning, just use Skitterbots instead of a Determination. We also pick up a Precision gem, but keep it on low level due to the mana requirement. We're also gonna use our Summon Ice Golem for extra added damage. For our Atlas tree, we have once again just a basic generic map progression Atlas tree. We're focusing on Wandering Path and skilling the small nodes in the beginning so we can reach up to 100% chance to drop an adjacent map from enemies that we kill in our maps. This will always ensure that we're gonna drop a map that is close to the one that on your Atlas that you just run, and in most cases it's gonna be 1 level higher. I will link to further information about Flicker Strike and even the Cold Flicker version in the description below. Make sure to check that out, because with this build, with Flicker Strike, you don't have to just league start it and later on switch to another build. You can literally play this build for the whole season. Especially when you progress further and get more gear, you might want to make the transition away from the Fire Flicker and go to a cold version. Or if you have the money for it, go for an original Sin and play Chaos Flicker Strike.